In 1527, villagers in a remote German valley stumbled upon a hidden grove filled with tiny bones, each one shattered in the same way. The discovery would unravel a nightmare, a secret cult operating for over 200 years, sacrificing children to appease forgotten gods. But who were these people, and why did they believe this was necessary? Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop a comment with your name, your city, and even the time of day. I want to see who's here for this story, because this isn't just history. It's evidence of something far darker, something that lingered in the shadows for centuries. And by the end, you'll understand why those bones were broken and what they meant. The villagers who first entered that secluded grove in 1527 assumed they'd stumbled upon an animal graveyard. At least that was their initial hope. The sheer number of small bones scattered beneath the undergrowth seemed impossible to reconcile with anything else. But as they began collecting them, patterns emerged. Each bone showed identical fracture lines running lengthwise, as if snapped with deliberate precision. Their unease grew when they noticed something the weathered bones still bore: faint cut marks near the joints, the kind made by blades removing flesh. Local authorities arrived within days, bringing a physician from the nearest town. His examination confirmed what everyone feared. These weren't animal remains. The bones matched the skeletal structure of children between the ages of 4 and 10. Even more disturbing was the spatial arrangement. Archaeologists would later document how the bones formed concentric circles radiating outward from a central stone slab, with skull fragments facing inward toward what appeared to be an altar stone. The fractures themselves told a story. They weren't the result of predators or accidental trauma. Tiny notch, as at the breakpoints, indicated the bones had been intentionally split while fresh, likely shortly after death. Some showed signs of charring, suggesting fire had been part of whatever ritual occurred there. The most chilling detail emerged when officials matched the fracture patterns to historic torture methods. The bones had been broken systematically, likely while the victims were restrained. Carbon dating placed the oldest bones in the 13th century. They found layers upon layers of remains spanning generations, meaning this wasn't some isolated incident. Whoever used this place returned to it repeatedly, over centuries. Authorities initially suspected a rogue bandit group operating in the forests, but the timeline ruled this out. The site showed signs of ongoing use by people who knew the terrain intimately, locals who buried their secrets in plain sight. When word reached church officials, their response surprised investigators. Instead of outrage, there was reluctance. Records show the local bishop initially dismissed the findings as pagan burials and warned against stirring up superstitions. Only when secular authorities threatened to involve regional lords did the church agree to assist. Even then, their representatives focused on collecting and consecrating the remains rather than identifying perpetrators. This strangeness only deepened when villagers began sharing whispers about the old rites their grandparents had mentioned in hushed tones. One account from a farmer's journal survived, a description of how his grandfather had been taken as a boy to the offering place, but ran when he saw other children being led to the stones. The entry abruptly ends with a warning to never speak of it again. Such fragmentary testimonies suggested an open secret among the valley's inhabitants, something known but not discussed outside trusted circles. By the time investigators mapped the full site, they'd catalogued remains from at least 47 children. The positioning of the bodies and the artifacts found near the altar left little doubt this was ritual sacrifice on an industrial scale. What began as a murder investigation now pointed to something far more organized, a sustained practice embedded within the community, possibly with tacit approval from some local leaders. The grove's discovery didn't solve a mystery, it created a bigger one. The existence of this site implied networks of belief stretching far beyond a single valley. Similar bone fractures appeared in medieval accounts from neighboring regions, previously dismissed as folklore. As officials widened their search, they found other groves with matching stone arrangements along ancient trade routes. Each new location confirmed their worst fears. Whatever this was, it had spread. The cult's practices didn't emerge in a vacuum. Their origins stretched back to pre-Christian fertility rites once common across the Germanic tribes. Before churches dominated the landscape, these communities worshipped deities tied to harvests, storms, and warfare, gods who demanded blood. Early records mention spring sacrifices where animals were ritually slain to ensure abundant crops. But somewhere in the 11th or 12th century, as Christianity spread, the traditions twisted. Underground groups began interpreting old texts more literally, believing the gods required human lives to withhold punishment. The shift from animal to child sacrifice appears tied to a specific deity. Fulco, a harvest god whose name translates roughly to the devourer. Carvings found near sacrificial sites depict a horned figure surrounded by kneeling children. Accompanying runes describe him as the taker of the pure, a being who would unleash blight and famine unless given the unblemished young. This wasn't random cruelty. The cult believed Fulco's favor deity determined whether entire villages starved. To them, sacrificing a few ensured survival for many. Their justifications followed a macabre logic. Children under 10 were considered untainted by sin, making them ideal vessels to carry messages to the gods. Adult sacrifices were rare. The cult's texts claimed grown souls were too burdened by lies to be effective offerings. There was also a transactional belief. The more pain inflicted during the ritual, the greater the deity's mercy. Fracturing bones supposedly released the child's spirit faster, sending it directly to Fulco's realm. Some inscriptions even describe the screams as hymns that pleased the gods. Knowledge passed through generations in coded ways. Midwives and village elders served as guardians of the tradition, teaching selected children through songs and seasonal ceremonies. One recovered manuscript contained nursery rhymes with hidden instructions. A verse about plucking the white flowers actually referred to selecting sacrifice candidates. The cult avoided written records, but archaeological finds reveal small tokens, carved wooden figures, bone amulets, left in homes to mark participating families. Fear-bound followers more tightly than any dogma. Parents who resisted risked losing everything. Their livestock would sicken, their fields would wither. Word spread of naysayers vanishing into the woods, their bodies later found with bones broken in familiar patterns. The cult didn't just kill dissenting adults, they made them warnings. Meanwhile, compliant families received favors, extra land, arranged marriages, and protection from raids. The system rewarded silence brutally enough that even church-going peasants kept altars hidden in their barns. Parallels exist with other dark traditions. The Carthaginians sacrificed infants to Baal Hammon, believing their ashes brought prosperity. The Aziz texts viewed child sacrifices as necessary to keep the sun was unique in its longevity. While most cultures abandoned such practices under outside pressure, this cult adapted instead of disappearing. When Christianity outlawed pagan rituals, they went underground, disguising their rites as Saints' Day celebrations. Local priests likely knew but turned a blind eye, fearing the chaos exposure would bring. Children were selected with meticulous care. Physical perfection mattered. Birthmarks or deformities disqualified them, as the gods supposedly rejected flawed vessels. Firstborn sons were often exempt, valued for labor, while later-born children, especially daughters, were considered ideal offerings. Some families reportedly volunteered children during hard times, believing it would earn divine favor. Others endured a lottery system where marked stones drawn at solstice gatherings decided who would be taken. The choice of children wasn't just theological, it was pragmatic. Adults could fight back or expose the cult. Children could be controlled, transported quietly, and their disappearances explained as accidents or animal attacks. Villagers would whisper about wolves in the woods while knowing full well what happened in the groves. This calculated approach let the system operate for centuries without major interference. What made these sacrifices different from other historical atrocities was the cold efficiency behind them. These weren't frenzied mobs. They were methodical rituals performed like agricultural chores. Records suggest preparations began weeks in advance. The children bathed in herb-infused waters, their hair braided with sacred cords. There are hints that some were given drugged honey to keep them docile. Then came the procession to the grove, the chanting, the precise placement of each child on the stone before the first bone snapped. The cult approached murder like baking. Bread. Measurements mattered. Every minute detail served the belief that any deviation would nullify the sacrifice's power. The tools they used were disturbingly ordinary: butcher's knives, woodworking mallets, flax ropes repurposed as restraints. There was no special dagger or ceremonial axe. What made them instruments of horror wasn't their design, but their context. The preparations began days before the ritual. Selected children were taken to a secluded farmhouse near the grove, where they were washed with water infused with henbane and belladonna, herbs known to induce drowsiness and compliance. Their hair was braided with red threads, symbolizing the life cord that would connect them to the gods. Parents who participated were instructed to tell neighbors the child had been sent to live with distant relatives. Those who asked too many questions received visits from men bearing the cult's mark, a small iron pendant shaped like a broken twig. On the night of the sacrifice, the children were led single file into the grove, their bare feet leaving faint impressions in the damp earth. Torches lined the path, but only every third one was lit, a deliberate tactic to disorient witnesses should any outsider stumble upon the ceremony. At the center stood the altar stone, its surface worn smooth by centuries of use. Carvings along its edges depicted Fulco's sigil, a horned figure with outstretched arms, each hand cradling a child-sized silhouette. The ritual leader, always a senior male from one of the founding families, wore a deerskin cloak dyed black with oak gall ink. His face remained covered by a wooden mask carved from yew, a tree associated with death in local folklore. Assistants bound the child's wrists and ankles with braided flax ropes tight enough to restrain but not enough to leave obvious marks. Forensic analysis of recovered bones shows the victims were positioned supine on the stone, limbs spread outward in a star pattern. A blacksmith's hammer
Tools
with a
were
rounded head,
consecrated
normally used for shaping metal, was passed through smoke from burning juniper branches. Knives were whetted against a special stone etched with runes. Witness accounts describe the leader invoking Fulco's name 3 times before the first blow landed. The fractures followed a precise sequence: left tibia, right fibula, pelvis, ribs. Medical experts studying bone fragments confirmed the breaks were methodical, progressing from non-lethal to fatal injuries to prolong consciousness. Death likely came from a final strike to the occipital bone at the base of the skull. Symbols played a crucial role. Each child's forehead was marked with a paste made from crushed beetles and charcoal, a mimicry of the god's mark described in cult texts. Assistants placed carved wooden animals around the altar, wolves for strength, hares for fertility, and crows to carry souls. The positioning mattered. Wolves faced outward as protectors while crows pointed toward the ritual leader, reinforcing the hierarchy. Keeping these ceremonies secret required meticulous planning. Gatherings coincided with Christian feast days when increased village activity masked comings and goings. Rumors were managed through a network of informants, millers, tavern keepers, even midwives who monitored pregnancies for future candidates. If outsiders grew suspicious, the cult staged distractions, a barn fire, a sudden cattle illness. Later excavations revealed diversion tunnels beneath some groves, allowing participants to disperse quickly if discovered. Psychological control extended beyond fear. Participants believed they were part of something greater, a lineage stretching back to their ancestors. After each sacrifice, attendees drank mead mixed with minute amounts of the victim's blood, creating a grotesque communal bond. Those who hesitated were reminded of the last famine, the stillborn calves, the blighted wheat. The cult framed resistance as selfishness, one child's life against an entire village's survival. Disposal methods evolved. Early sacrifices were buried upright in shallow pits, arranged as if standing guard around the grove. By the 15th century, they'd switched to cremation, scattering ashes in nearby fields as blessings. Archaeologists found layers of burnt bone fragments mixed with barley seeds, a grim fertilizer. Only skull fragments received special treatment. These were drilled with holes and strung on ropes hung in sacred oaks until the leather rotted away. Physical evidence leaves no doubt. Soil analysis shows elevated phosphorus levels at altar sites, consistent with repeated blood absorption. Tool marks on bones match implements found buried in nearby farms. Most damning are the surviving ledgers from a monastery that was briefly investigated in the 1420s, recording testimonies from two escaped victims before the pages were abruptly torn out. One boy's account describes seeing the black masks before his sister was taken into the trees. These rituals weren't frenzied orgies of violence, but calculated ceremonies with specific objectives. Every fracture, every chant, every drop of blood served Fulco's hunger. The cult operated with the cold efficiency of farmers sowing fields, another seasonal duty to ensure survival. Yet for all their planning, they couldn't account for one variable: the parents who eventually refused to let their children become offerings. Parents didn't surrender their children willingly, at least not at first. The cult's control over villages relied on a blend of coercion and manufactured consent. Economic pressure proved most effective. Drought-prone regions saw crop failures every few years, and the cult positioned itself as the sole provider during famines, fam. Elis who participated received extra grain from communal stores, priority use of mills, and exemptions from feudal labor duties. Tax collectors mysteriously found their fields sabotaged, their livestock poisoned, or their sons drafted into mercenary companies. Social isolation wore down resistors. One family chronicle from 1412 describes how the Hofmeyers lost all trading privileges after refusing to participate. Their daughters received no marriage offers, neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. When their youngest vanished 6 months later, no one asked questions. The father's journal ends with a single line: "We should have given them Annika." Similar stories repeat across parish records, vague notes about accidents befalling uncooperative families, always followed by sudden compliance from surviving relatives. The cult's enforcers employed psychological tactics, too. They staged midnight visits where masked men appeared at bedsides to whisper threats. Children reported waking to find black feathers pinned to their nightclothes, a sign they'd been marked for the next ritual. Some parents broke after being shown the bones of previous resistors arranged in their fields. A 1483 deposition describes a farmer finding his neighbor's skeletal remains posed as if plowing, the spine meticulously fractured in 17 places. Not all participation was coerced. Over generations, belief systems twisted. Parents genuinely came to think that sacrifice ensured prosperity. In harvest cycles where children were offered, yields did improve, because cult members secretly diverted resources to participating farms. Families convinced themselves their child's death had saved the village. Some even took pride in selection, viewing it as divine favor. Church records note cases where mothers bragged about their child's purity being recognized. The Schaefer family provides a chilling case study. 5 generations of their clan served as cult intermediaries. Tax rolls show their landholding was tripled between 1380 to 1450. Family letters reveal how they rationalized handing over grandchildren. Better one brief pain than watching all starve. But cracks appeared when a daughter-in-law protested. Within weeks, 3 sheepdogs were found hanged on their property. The next spring, their granary burned. When their 6-year-old was taken, no one objected. Forensic analysis of the grove's later burials matched the child's remains through dental patterns. The psychological toll manifested oddly. Participating parents developed rituals of their own, burning their child's clothing instead of passing it down, or keeping lockets filled with charred barley from the sacrifice site. Some villages had mourning stones where mothers would kneel at dawn but never weep audibly. The cult banned overt grief, calling it an insult to Fulco's generosity. Control mechanisms extended beyond terror. The cult manipulated information ruthlessly. They circulated fake histories portraying earlier famines as divine punishment for insufficient sacrifices. Each drought was framed as retribution for parental reluctance. Elders recited poems about villages wiped out by plague after refusing the gods' terms. When real disasters struck neighboring regions, cult leaders pointed to them as proof of their doctrine. Estimates suggest at least 800 children died across the cult's operational range. Mortality peaked during the Great Famine of 1315-17, when records indicate groves received monthly offerings. But the practice wasn't limited to crises. Excavated ledgers show regular sacrifices every 3rd summer, regardless of conditions, a maintenance ritual to renew Fulco's contract. What makes these numbers unsettling is their distribution. The cult didn't just prey on the poor or outcast. Tax records prove prosperous families participated at equal rates. When the Bishop of Trier investigated in 1491, he found cult symbols carved into the bedframes of local nobility. This wasn't desperation, it was systemic indoctrination woven into the fabric. Uncomfortable questions. How many parents truly believed? How many acted out of fear? The bones don't answer that, but they do show one pattern. Fractures became cleaner over time, as if practitioners grew more skilled at enacting their horrors. By the early 1500s, the system began cracking. Trade routes brought new ideas. Younger generations questioned old fears. And somewhere in a remote valley, a critical mass of parents finally said no. Their defiance wouldn't end the cult, but it would force it to adapt. The next phase would see these horrors spread beyond their heartland, carried along paths no one thought to watch. The cult didn't remain confined to its German Valley birthplace. By the late 1300s, reports surfaced of similar rituals occurring in the Vosges Mountains, 200 miles west. This expansion followed trade routes used by wool merchants and traveling tinsmiths, professions the cult deliberately infiltrated. A 1384 ledger from a Strasbourg merchant house notes several blacksmith priests purchasing hammers and knives in bulk, far more than any workshop would need. These men doubled as recruiters, targeting villages recovering from plague outbreaks when people were most desperate for protection. Their recruitment tactics varied by region. In wine-growing areas, they framed sacrifices as necessary for healthy vineyards. Forest communities heard warnings about wood spirits demanding tribute. The cult strategically adapted Fulco's identity. Near coastal areas, he became Nehelenia's horned consort, borrowing from local sea goddess worship. Archaeologists found altars where original carvings of Fulco were later modified with fish scales and wave motifs to match regional mythology. This flexibility made the cult dangerously effective at embedding itself in new territories. Traveling performers provided another vector for spread. Troops of dancing priests moved between festivals, their elaborate costumes hiding cult symbols. They staged morality plays about wrathful gods punishing ungrateful villages, followed by private meetings with local leaders. Church records from Burgundy describe actors being chased out of town after children began disappearing following their performances. Witnesses reported seeing the same troupe later in Switzerland, where similar vanishings occurred weeks later. Local authorities often failed to connect these incidents. The cult exploited medieval Europe's fractured governance. What counted as a crime in one duchy might be ignored in the next. When Bavarian officials investigated child disappearances in 1422, they found families too fearful to speak. Those who did blamed forest demons, not realizing their neighbors participated willingly. The cult's decentralized structure made it nearly invisible. No central temple, no written doctrine, just whispered traditions passed between trusted families. Some regions did resist. In the Alsace region, village militias formed night watches after noting travelers' children vanishing near old pagan sites. A 1453 incident saw 3 cult members lynched when caught carrying bone fragments. But even these setbacks taught the cult valuable lessons. They began targeting weaker communities first. Villages decimated by recent conflicts or situated on disputed borders where authorities rarely ventured. Tracking their expansion proved challenging because they modified practices based on local conditions. In mountainous regions, sacrifices occurred in caves rather than groves. Coastal sites show evidence of drownings replacing bone breaking. A grisly discovery in the Swiss Alps revealed children's remains wedged into crevices at high altitudes, an adaptation of Fulco's worship of mountain deities. The consistent thread was the fractures. Whether buried, burned, or submerged, the bones always bore those telltale evidence emerges of the cult reaching startling distances. A merchant's letter from Brittany references German rites performed during a drought. Swedish church wall paintings depict horned figures surrounded by small skeletons, an unusual motif absent from Nordic tradition. The furthest confirmed site lies near Krakow, where excavations uncovered a stone circle containing child remains with telltale German-style fractures alongside Slavic ritual objects. Estimates suggest the cult established sacrificial sites in at least 47 locations across Central Europe. Their reach wasn't uniform. They clustered along rivers and old Roman roads, avoiding areas with strong centralized rule. Church response varied wildly. Some bishops ordered inquisitions, while others quietly tolerated the practices, fearing rebellion more than heresy. A papal bull from 1489 condemned certain forest congregations, but stopped short of naming the cult directly, reflecting how little Rome understood the threat's scale. The spread wasn't limitless. Natural barriers helped. The cult never gained traction in flat, open regions like the Netherlands, where secrecy proved impossible. Cultural differences mattered too. Regions with strong mother goddess traditions resisted Fulco's masculine imagery. Yet by 1500, the cult had infected an area roughly the size of modern Austria, with outposts stretching from the Rhine to the Vistula. This expansion contained the seeds of the cult's eventual exposure. As they moved into new territories, they lost tight control over members. Rumors spread farther. Witnesses who didn't share the cult's conditioning spoke more freely. The system that relied on rural isolation began failing near cities where divergent beliefs collided. But before authorities could act, the cult would demonstrate its most terrifying capability, the power to filtrate the very institutions tasked with stopping it. The first official response came in 1468 when Strasbourg authorities arrested a wool merchant named Heinrich Gruber. Guards found small bones wrapped in red thread hidden in his cart, along with a ledger listing children's names beside dates that matched local disappearances. But Gruber never stood trial. He hanged himself in his cell using braided flax rope, the same material used in the cult's rituals. His death should have sparked a major investigation. Instead, the records were sealed. Only fragments remain, mentioning unclean rites and a recommendation to avoid panic. This pattern repeated for decades, partial discoveries followed by quiet closures. Church responses were fractured. While some bishops, like Johann von Baden, openly condemned the practices, others actively obstructed investigations. The Archbishop of Trier's private correspondence reveals he ordered priests to burn any evidence of child sacrifices in 1491, fearing it would weaken faith in the Church's dominion. Meanwhile, inquisitors who pushed too hard met suspicious ends. Father Anselm of Würzburg disappeared in 1502 after documenting 18 sacrificial sites. His journal was found years later, buried near an altar stone, its later pages scraped clean. Secular authorities faced different obstacles. The cult intentionally operated across jurisdictional boundaries. When Bavarian forces raided a suspected grove in 1517, the ringleaders simply moved operations to lands controlled by the Count Palatine, where they enjoyed protection. Legal systems weren't equipped to handle crimes spanning multiple territories. Witnesses willing to testify in one duchy couldn't be compelled to appear in another. The cult exploited these gaps, ensuring no single lord had enough evidence to act decisively. Public reactions swung between horror and complicity. When word leaked about the Strasbourg bones in 1475, mobs lynched 3 suspected cult members before villagers shielded known participants, arguing they'd brought good harvests. This divide made prosecutions nearly impossible. Juries often included cult sympathizers. A 1489 trial in Rothenburg collapsed when half the jury suddenly recanted their oaths, claiming divine visions instructed them to acquit. Actual convictions were rare but brutal. The handful of successful prosecutions shows medieval justice at its most extreme. In 1494, Swiss authorities broke up a cell near Basel. The leader, a miller named Rutger Bloch, endured 7 days of torture before confessing to sacrificing 12 children. His execution involved elements mocking the cult's rituals. They fractured his limbs sequentially before burning him alive. Assistants were buried alive in standing positions around the execution site, a grisly warning that backfired when cult members later turned these graves into shrines. Effective crackdowns required unprecedented cooperation. In 1521, 5 German principalities formed a rare alliance after discovering a sacrificial network spanning their borders. Their joint investigation lasted 3 years, employing mercenaries to raid groves simultaneously across the region. They arrested over 60 suspects, though most lower-ranking members avoided punishment by turning informant. The real breakthrough came when they intercepted coded messages between cells, simple shepherd's tallies that tracked offerings per territory. Preventative measures varied in effectiveness. Some lords ordered sacred groves cleared only to find new altars appearing in nearby caves. Authorities in Alsace tried assigning guards to watch families who'd lost children, but the cult simply switched to targeting travelers' children instead. The most successful approach came from Archbishop Berthold of Mainz, who in 1526 instituted a system where priests had to account for every baptism and investigate any child not presented for annual blessing. This forced the cult to either risk exposure or steal children from farther afield. The cult's downfall came from an unexpected source: literacy. As printed pamphlets spread descriptions of their methods, isolated cells struggled to maintain secrecy. A peasant uprising in 1533 near Freiburg began when a traveling schoolteacher recognized cult symbols carved into a local lord's doorframe. Armed with this knowledge, villagers stormed the estate and uncovered an underground shrine containing recent child remains. Similar discoveries snowballed across the region over the next 5 years. By 1540, the organized network was broken. Surviving members fled eastward or went to ground in remote areas. Authorities erected warning stones at former groves, some still standing today with weathered inscriptions like, "Here evil rites were performed." But the scattered nature of the cult meant no definitive end. Smaller cells likely persisted for generations, their practices growing more fragmented over time. The last confirmed prosecution occurred in 1611 near the Bohemian border, where a farmer was convicted of sacrificing his grandchild during a plague outbreak. What authorities couldn't eradicate was the underlying belief system. Folk tales from the region still speak of the old bargain and the price of good harvests. Farmers as late as the 1800s reported finding strange bone arrangements in their fields after droughts. And in some remote valleys, grandmothers whispered that certain stones were best left unturned. The cult's physical network was dismantled, but its shadow lingered in the collective memory of the land. This persistence would give birth to new legends and troubling modern parallels. The cult's influence didn't vanish when authorities dismantled its network. Within a generation of the crackdowns, reports emerged of modified rituals where they left offerings during droughts. No longer children, but still adhering to the old patterns. Church records from 1572 note priests destroying false altars built near former sacrificial groves, suggesting fragments of the tradition persisted. The fear lingered longest in rural areas. A Franciscan monk's diary from 1620 describes villagers in the Black Forest refusing to enter certain clearings, claiming they could hear the broken ones whispering at dusk. Local religious practices absorbed some of the cult's elements despite church opposition. Spring festivals in the Rhineland began featuring symbolic breaking rituals, snapping twigs instead of bones. Some villages appointed blessing men who performed protective gestures resembling the cult's old chants. These adaptations worried church authorities enough that in 1594 the Bishop of Speyer ordered all midwives examined for knowledge of the forbidden signs. Several were found with small bone fragments sewn into their aprons, a clear carryover from the cult's belief in protective talismans. Folk tales amplified the horror over centuries. The Brothers Grimm recorded a Hessian legend in 1812 about the bone gatherer, a spectral figure who collected children who wandered near certain trees. Another story from Bavaria warned of harvest wives, who demanded a child every 7 years to guarantee good crops. These weren't pure fantasies. Anthropologists note striking parallels between the tales and actual cult practices. The motifs grew more symbolic over time, but the core remained: break something innocent to preserve the whole. Modern parallels exist in unsettling ways. Organizational psychologists point to the cult's recruitment tactics as early examples of coercive control, isolating members, controlling information, and punishing dissent. The justification of sacrificing a few to save many mirrors the defenses used by extremist groups throughout history. Even the bone-breaking finds echoes in modern forensic files. A 1998 German murder case revealed a killer using similar fracture patterns. though he claimed no knowledge of the historic cult. The question of survival persists. In 1923, a forestry crew in Thuringia discovered a cave containing recent animal bones arranged in Fulco's signature patterns alongside Wabibo II-era coins. Polish border guards reported intercepting a group transporting a child's remains in 1947. The autopsy revealed methodical fractures. More recently, a 2018 archaeological survey in Saxony found a ritual site with bones dated to the 1950s, positioned identically to medieval examples. None of these incidents confirmed an unbroken lineage, but the similarities are hard to ignore. The most compelling evidence emerged in 2004. Construction workers near Trier uncovered a basement sealed since the late 1600s. Inside, they found a wooden chest containing cult paraphernalia, a yew-wood mask, ritual hammers wrapped in red thread, and meticulous records of offerings continuing until 1789. The handwriting changed over generations, suggesting knowledge passed through a family line. Most chilling was a ledger page dated 1702 describing how to adapt rituals for times of scrutiny, including substitutions of animal bones that retained the proper fracture sequences. Theories about modern adherence split scholars. Some argue the cult exists in fragmented family traditions, their practices diluted but recognizable. Others believe the methods were adopted by unconnected groups, the same way serial killers sometimes copy historical murders. A third camp maintains the cult's true legacy is psychological, the enduring human willingness to sacrifice others under threat. What's undeniable is the pattern's persistence. Between 2010 to 2020, German police investigated 7 cases involving ritualistic child harm with elements mirroring the old forensic anthropologists noted troubling consistencies. The targeting of specific age groups, the systematic breaking of bones in non-random sequences, even the use of henbane derivatives to sedate victims. The most recent discovery came last year. A farmer in Baden-Württemberg ploughing his field uncovered a stone box buried just 2 feet down. Inside were the remains of a modern domestic cat, every bone meticulously fractured. Wrapped around the skeleton was a braided cord identical to those found in 15th century sacrifice sites. Carbon dating placed the remains somewhere between 1980 and 2000. Authorities found no identifying marks, no leads, just another silent message from the shadows of history. These fragments suggest we haven't seen the last chapter of this story. Whether as active practitioners or dark inspiration, the cult's shadow stretches further into the present than most dare to consider. Their true legacy may not be in bones buried in groves, but in the realization that such horrors aren't confined to the past. Their possibilities etched into human nature itself. The stones still stand in those German valleys, worn smooth by time. And somewhere, someone may still be reading the old signs. The cult's story reveals more than historical horror. It exposes how easily communities normalize atrocity when survival seems at stake. Those shattered bones tell us something uncomfortable about human nature, the capacity to rationalize anything given enough fear and time. If an organized child sacrifice network could operate openly for centuries, what other atrocities have we forgotten or chosen to ignore? Every forest probably holds secrets we'd rather not uncover. Check the description for sources if you want to dig deeper. Have you encountered traces of this history where you live? Drop a comment below. Sometimes the darkest stories surface in unexpected places.